Remembers before cities, before kings, before writing, before even farming, something happened that quietly rewired the human story. Remembers, not a war, not a discovery, not a single invention, but a shift so deep that once it began, humanity could never fully turn back. Remembers, imagine this for a moment. For more than 90% of our existence, humans lived one way: we moved. Remembers, we followed animals, we followed seasons, we left almost nothing behind: no walls, no monuments, no borders. Remember, survival meant flexibility. When the land failed, you walked away. Then around 11,700 years ago, the ice began to retreat. Remembers, not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough to change everything. Massive ice sheets that had dominated the northern hemisphere for tens of thousands of years slowly dissolved. Remembers, the Laurentide ice sheet pulled back from North America. The Fennoscandian ice sheet loosened its grip on northern Europe. Remembers, entire landscapes once buried under kilometers of ice reappeared. And as temperatures rose, the world did just get warmer. Remembers, it became different. Tundra gave way to forests. Birch and pine spread first, then oak and elm. Ecosystems reorganized themselves. And with them, the rules humans had lived by for millennia began to collapse. The great ice age animals, mammoths, remembers, woolly rhinos, giant ground sloths, cave bears, saber-toothed cats started disappearing. Some vanished slowly. Remembers, others abruptly. The exact reasons still debated: climate stress, human hunting, likely both. But from a human perspective, one thing mattered more than theory: the big game was gone. For Paleolithic hunters, this wasn't just an inconvenience. Remembers, it was an existential shock. These animals weren't optional calories, they were the foundation of life: food. Remembers, tools, clothing, social rituals, identity, and suddenly they were no longer reliable. This is where I want to pause. Remembers, because this moment is usually summarized too cleanly in textbooks. We often told climate improved. Humans adapted, agriculture followed. That version skips the most important part: fear, uncertainty. Remembers, pressure. When your survival strategy stops working, you don't calmly innovate, you scramble, you experiment. Remembers, you make decisions without knowing their long-term consequences. This wasn't progress, it was triage. Remembers, across the Levant and Eastern Mediterranean, we see people responding to this pressure in subtle but profound ways. Remembers, they didn't immediately plant crops, they didn't suddenly invent farming. Instead, they began doing something far more dangerous. Remember, they started staying. Sites like Ain Malaha and Wadi Hamish show the earliest hints of this shift. Remembers, not cities, not farms, but repeated occupation of the same places: circular stone houses, plastered floors. Remembers, storage areas carved into the ground. These weren't temporary camps, they were commitments, and commitments change how you think. Remembers, for mobile foragers, the future is short: a season, a migration cycle, a known rhythm. If resources decline, remember, mobility is resilience, but when you stay in one place, failure doesn't move away from you. Remembers, it piles up. Staying means betting that the land will keep giving. It means planning not just for today, remembers, but for months ahead. It means storing food, and stored food changes everything, because storage creates time. And time creates anxiety. Once food exists beyond the moment of consumption, questions appear: who controls it? Remembers, who protects it? Who decides how it's shared? What happens when it runs out? Remembers, this is where the Natufian culture becomes impossible to ignore. Living roughly between 12,500 and 900 BC, the Natufians occupy one of the most unstable chapters in human environmental history. Remembers, they lived through warming and then through the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to cold. Remembers, dry conditions that shocked ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. Their world did not gently improve. Remembers, it lurched, yet instead of returning fully to mobility, many Natufian groups doubled down on place. Remembers, they developed specialized tools for processing wild cereals: mortars and pestles heavy enough to stay put. Remember, sickle blades that show microscopic silica gloss, the physical trace of cutting grass stems over and over again. Remembers, that gloss matters. It tells us this wasn't casual gathering, it was routine, planned, scheduled around seasons. Remembers, these people were no longer just taking what the land offered, they were organizing their lives around it. Remembers, and this is the psychological pivot that fascinates me. At some point, quietly, without ceremony, humans began treating nature not as something to move through, but something to manage. Management sounds harmless, responsible even, but management implies control, and control comes with costs. Remembers, when the Younger Dryas struck, those costs became visible. Cold, dry conditions reduced the availability of wild plants. Remembers, large game became even scarcer. Some sites were abandoned entirely, others adapted. At places like Abu Huraira, we see a clear shift in diet. People turn to smaller seeds, nuts. Remembers, in tubers, foods that require far more processing but are more reliable under stress. Grinding stones multiplied. Remembers, roasting pits appeared. Toolkits became more standardized, more efficient. This wasn't innovation driven by comfort. Remembers, it was innovation driven by fear. And here's the part that unsettles me: these people were not farming yet. Remembers, but they were already doing something farmers do. They were intensifying effort on a fixed piece of land. That's the real break with the past. Hunting spreads risk across space. If one area fails, you move. Intensive plant use concentrates risk. If one place fails, everything fails. Why take that risk? Remembers, because the alternative, constant movement in a world with shrinking returns, was becoming just as dangerous. Remembers, this is where the old question starts to crack. We often ask, why did humans invent agriculture? But standing here, remembers, at this moment of pressure and uncertainty, a better question emerges. What choice did they really have? Remembers, once you build houses, once you store food, once you bury your dead beneath the floor, leaving is no longer a neutral option. Remembers, burials inside settlements appear during this time, and they are not incidental, they bind memory to place. Remembers, they say our ancestors are here. Leaving now means abandoning not just resources but identity. This is how landscapes become emotional. Remembers, this is how land becomes something you defend, and defense, once introduced, never disappears. Remembers, as the Younger Dryas ended and the Holocene began, climate stabilized again. Wild cereals and legumes spread across the Fertile Crescent. Remembers, emmer, wheat, einkorn, barley, lentils, peas. Abundance returned, but only for those already organized to exploit it. Remembers, here's the quiet irony: agriculture didn't appear because humans suddenly understood plants better. Remembers, plants changed because humans had already changed, saving seeds, harvesting from dense stands. Preferring plants that held on to their grains. Over generations, without intention, humans reshaped biology. Remembers, domestication wasn't a decision, it was a side effect, and once that process began, it locked humans into a new relationship with time, members, land, and each other. This is where the story truly starts to feel dangerous, because permanence creates momentum. Remembers, and momentum doesn't ask whether you're ready. Hello and welcome to Empire's Historical. If this opening already feels unsettling, remembers, that's intentional, because the real story of civilization doesn't begin with progress, it begins with pressure, compromise, and choices made under fear. Remembers, if you want to follow this journey all the way from the first uneasy settlements to the rise of power, belief and conflict, consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to support deeper, long-form explorations like this. Remembers, and it helps keep these stories alive. In the next part, the story takes a turn that still shocks archaeologists today. Remembers, because right when humans were struggling to survive, they began building monuments that served no practical purpose at all. Remembers, and once we step into that world, there's no turning back. As what began as a reluctant decision to stay rather than move now started to reshape the human mind itself. Remembers, because once people stopped thinking in terms of routes and began thinking in terms of places, remembers, survival was no longer just about endurance, it became about management. This is the point where the story quietly changes direction. Remembers, not the sudden invention, not with a clear plan, but with a shift in attention. Remembers, if part 1 was about pressure forcing humans to slow down and stay, then this part is about what happened after staying became normal. Remembers, and this is where things get deeply uncomfortable, because staying put does not simply change where you live. Remembers, it changes how you think about the future, and how you think about the future determines everything that follows. Remembers, for mobile hunter-gatherers, the world is wide and forgiving. Mistakes can be escaped, overused land can be abandoned. Remember, scarcity is solved with distance. The future is cyclical, not linear. You return, but you do not accumulate. But once a group commits to a place even tentatively, that logic collapses. At Natufian sites across the Levant, remembers, we begin to see this mental shift fossilized into stone. Not just houses, but designed spaces. Not just tools, remembers, but specialized tools. Not just food consumption, but food processing systems. Stone mortars fixed into the ground, as pestles shaped to fit the hand. Remember, sickle blades repeatedly resharpened until their edges carried the microscopic sheen of silica. Polish, thousands of identical motions. Remembers, repeated season after season. This is not opportunistic behavior, this is routine, and routine is dangerous. Remembers, because routine assumes tomorrow. Once you expect tomorrow, you begin to plan for it. Once you plan for it, remembers, you start investing in it. And once you invest, walking away becomes costly, not just materially, but psychologically. Remembers, I keep thinking about this moment as the birth of a new anxiety. Mobile societies fear the present. As predators, weather, immediate hunger. Sedentary societies fear the future. Will the harvest fail? Will the storage last? Remembers, will others take what we saved? And fear of the future is what creates systems. The Natufians didn't farm yet, remembers, but they were already behaving like people who couldn't afford uncertainty. They intensified their relationship with land. Remembers, they didn't just gather wild cereals, they returned to the same stands again and again. Remembers, they didn't just eat what they found, they processed it, stored it, protected it. This is where management enters human life for the first time. Management of plants, management of time. Remembers, management of labor, and management always produces hierarchy even if no one intends it to, because once food requires processing, remember, someone controls the tools. Once food is stored, someone controls access. Once access is controlled, remembers, decisions must be made. Who eats first? Who eats during scarcity? Who guards the stores? These are not philosophical questions. They are survival questions, and they demand authority. What's striking is how early this authority begins to leave traces. Burials inside settlements become more common. People are laid to rest beneath floors, within walls. Remembers, inside the living space itself, this is not just convenience, it is symbolic. The dead now belong to the place. Remembers, and once the dead are anchored, the living become anchored too. You don't abandon land where your ancestors are buried. This is how land stops being territory and becomes identity. But identity carries obligations. During the Young the Dryas, remembers when cold and dryness returned unexpectedly, these obligations became a trap. The environment turned hostile again. Wild plants became less predictable, large game remained scarce, and yet instead of reverting fully to mobility, remembers many communities intensified their efforts even further. At sites like Abu Huraira, diets shift dramatically. As people turn toward foods that are harder to process but more reliable: small seeds, tubers, nuts. Grinding stones multiply. Remembers, roasting pits become common, toolkits grow more standardized, more efficient, more optimized. This is a crucial pattern. Remembers, innovation here is not driven by abundance, it is driven by desperation, and desperation narrows options. Once you've invested in heavy tools, storage pits, permanent structures, and social systems tied to a place, remembers, mobility becomes less adaptive, not more. This is the paradox. The very strategies designed to reduce risk end up concentrating it. Remembers, and this is where the real transformation happens, not in technology but in values. Success is no longer measured by flexibility. Remembers, is measured by control. Control over land, control over food, control over labor, and control has a momentum of its own. As the Holocene climate stabilized again around 11700 BC, the landscape responded. Wild cereals and legumes expanded rapidly across the Fertile Crescent. Dense stands of emmer wheat, incorn and barley appeared, lentils and peas proliferated. Remembers, nature offered abundance but only to those already prepared to organize around it. Remembers, this is why I find the traditional story of humans inventing agriculture so misleading. It suggests intention. Remembers, what we actually see is inevitability. Once people had committed to managing land, agriculture wasn't a choice as a consequence. Seed saving wasn't ideology, it was practicality. Harvesting from dense stands wasn't planning, it was efficiency. Remembers, preferring non-shattering plants wasn't science, it was convenience. But over generations these conveniences accumulated. Remembers, plants changed, human behavior changed, dependency deepened, and dependency is the most powerful force in social evolution. Remembers, because dependency eliminates alternatives. By this point, humans were no longer just adapting to the environment. Remembers, they were shaping it. Fields replaced wild mosaics, grazing patterns shifted, plant populations became human-dependent. Remembers, landscapes stopped regenerating on their own terms. And once that happens, collapse becomes catastrophic rather than inconvenient. Remembers, this is the moment I keep returning to, the moment where the human story narrows. Before this, there were many ways to live. From after this, there were fewer, and fewer still as time went on. Remembers, what unsettles me most is how invisible this transition would have felt to the people living through it. No one woke up and said, today we abandon mobility forever. They were just solving problems. Cold winters. Remembers, unreliable food. Growing populations. Each solution made sense in isolation. Together they formed a system that demanded continuity. Remembers, this is why I resist calling this progress. Progress implies direction. What I see here is entanglement. Remembers, humans, plants, animals, tools, beliefs, and land becoming so tightly woven together that pulling one threatens the whole structure. And once entangled, societies begin to behave differently. They defend rather than flee. They intensify rather than adapt. Remembers, they centralize rather than distribute. This is not yet civilization, but it is the psychological foundation of it. Remembers, because the next step, monumental belief, organized ritual. Remembers, large-scale cooperation only makes sense in a world where people are already bound to place and future. Remembers, and that's where the story goes next, because once humans accepted management as a way of life, they didn't just manage food. Remembers, they began managing meaning itself, and that, more than agriculture, is what truly changed the world. Remembers, and once management became the organizing principle of life, it did not stop at food or land, it moved inward, but towards something far less visible but far more powerful: meaning. Remembers, this is the point where the story stops being only about survival and starts becoming about belief. Remembers, up to now, everything we've followed could still be explained as necessity: climate pressure, scarcity, risk management, people staying because moving no longer guaranteed safety, intensifying effort because flexibility was failing. Remembers, but then we encounter something that refuses to fit neatly into that logic, something that, even today, makes archaeologists hesitate before speaking too confidently: Göbekli Tepe. When I first try to imagine this place as it existed around 9500 BC, remembers, I have to actively strip away everything modern instinct wants to project onto it. No metal, no pottery. Remembers, no wheeled transport, possibly no fully domesticated plants or animals, and yet what rises out of the ground is not a shelter, or not a village, not a defensive structure, but a landscape of monuments. Massive circular enclosures carved into bedrock, or limestone pillars shaped into towering T-forms, some weighing over 16 tons. Surfaces covered in reliefs so deliberate and so consistent that calling them decoration feels dishonest. Remembers, this is not ornament, it's language. What unsettles me isn't just the scale, it's the timing. Remembers, Göbekli Tepe appears at precisely the moment when humans are still negotiating whether they can afford to stay in one place. Food security is fragile, climate memory is raw, risk is everywhere, and yet, instead of investing all surplus effort into securing calories, Remembers, these people poured thousands of labor hours into something that does not feed anyone, at least not directly. Remembers, so the question stops being how could they build this, the real question is why would they need to? Remembers, Göbekli Tepe shows no clear signs of permanent habitation, no houses clustered around it. Remembers, no daily domestic refuse you'd expect from a village. It appears to have been a place people traveled to, gathered at, then left, which means coordination on a scale previously unseen. People from different groups, remembers, possibly different regions, arriving at the same place at the same time for the same purpose. That purpose was not economic. Remembers, it was symbolic. When you look closely at the pillars, the message becomes stranger, not clearer. Many of them appear anthropomorphic. Remembers, the T-shape likely represents a stylized human form. Some pillars have carved arms and hams resting across the torso. Remembers, no faces, no individuality. These are not people, they are representations of something beyond people. And then there are the animals, foxes, boar snakes, scorpions, vultures, predators appear repeatedly. Remembers, often positioned above prey, often rendered with a force that feels intentional rather than illustrative. Certain animals recur across enclosures, suggesting shared rules about placement and meaning. This is not random myth-making. Remembers, it is a system of symbols, and systems of symbols do not emerge spontaneously, they require agreement. Remembers, memory transmission, which implies specialists, people who knew which symbols mattered, who remembered stories. Remembers, who decided what could be carved and what could not. This is where belief stops being personal and becomes social infrastructure. Remembers, because belief does something that food cannot, it organizes strangers. You do not need belief to feed your family. Remembers, you need belief to coordinate hundreds of people without coercion. That's the part I can't ignore. Göbekli Tepe suggests that long before formal hierarchy, before kings or states, as humans had already discovered a different form of power, the power of shared meaning, ritual. Feasting. Remembers, story, archaeological evidence from the site points to massive communal meals, thousands of animal bones. Remembers, often from wild game hunted at scale. This kind of feasting requires planning, coordination, and excess. Remembers, you don't feast unless you believe the gathering itself matters, and feasting is never neutral. It creates obligation. It creates hierarchy, it creates memory. People remember who hosted, who provided, who led the ritual. Members who spoke the words, and once people remember, status begins to form. Here's the feedback loop that starts to emerge. Remembers, belief brings people together. Gathering increases food demand pressures landscapes, landscape intensifies management. Meaning and material survival begin reinforcing each other. Remembers, this is why I think the question of whether agriculture came before belief is backward. Remembers, Göbekli Tepe suggests belief may have forced agriculture into existence. If people are gathering seasonally for ritual, remembers, they need predictable surplus. If predictable surplus doesn't exist naturally, it must be created. Remembers, if it must be created, plants must be managed more intensively, not because of ideology. Remembers, because belief is non-negotiable once it becomes central to identity. Compare this with Jericho emerging around the same broad period, and the contrast becomes illuminating. Jericho is not symbolic first, it is territorial. Massive stone walls. A tower rising more than 8 meters high, carefully fitted stone blocks, an internal staircase. This is not ritual excess. This is defense. Jericho sat beside a reliable freshwater spring in an increasingly crowded world. That spring was life itself, and life, once defended, becomes power. Walls tell us something Göbekli Tepe does not. Remember, they tell us that competition had arrived. Once people are bound to place through ancestors, belief, remember, storage, and ritual, other people become threats. You cannot flee without losing everything you've invested. Remembers, so you fortify, and fortification changes social structure. You need leaders to organize labor, guards to enforce boundaries. As decision makers to allocate resources during crisis, authority becomes centralized. And authority, remembers, almost inevitably wraps itself in belief. This is where belief and power fuse. Göbekli Tepe represents belief organizing labor. Remembers, Jericho represents power defending resources. Together they form the blueprint of civilization. But what's chilling is how quickly this logic escalates. Once rituals anchor people to place, monuments anchor memory. Remembers, once memory is anchored, time itself becomes structured. Calendars matter, seasons matter, alignments matter. Remembers, suddenly knowing when the sun rises or the moon turns is no longer curiosity, is control. Control of planting. Remembers, control of ceremony, control of social rhythm. Those who understand time gain authority over those who live inside it. Remembers, this is where specialists appear not as craftsmen but as interpreters of reality, people who know the stories. Remembers, people who read the sky, people who mediate between the living and the dead. They don't need weapons. They need legitimacy, and legitimacy, once established, is extraordinarily durable. Remembers, I find myself wondering how it felt to stand inside one of those enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the stone rising above you. Remembers, the animals watching from the pillars, the knowledge that generations before you stood in the same place. Remembers, performed the same rituals, heard the same stories. That kind of experience does something to the human mind. Remembers, it shrinks the individual and expands the collective, and once the collective becomes sacred, questioning it becomes dangerous. Remember, this is where the path narrows, because belief can stabilize a society, but it can also trap it. Once meaning is embedded in stone, remembers, changing course becomes heresy. Once ancestors are bound to land, leaving becomes betrayal. Once ritual defines identity, remembers, adaptation slows, and yet from the perspective of the people living through it, none of this would feel like loss. Remembers, it would feel like belonging, security, purpose. This is why Göbekli Tepe matters so much, not because it is old, remembers, but because it reveals that civilization did not begin with plows or crops. It began with stories powerful enough to make people stay. Remembers, and once humans learned how to organize themselves around shared meaning, once belief became a technology, everything else followed. Remember, specialization, hierarchy, tradeflict, the tools would change, the logic would not. In the next part, that logic accelerates. Because once belief and management fuse, societies no longer just gather, they expand, compete and fight. And the question is no longer how humans survived a changing world. Remembers, it becomes whether the systems they built to survive would eventually turn against them. Remembers, and once belief gave people a reason to gather, to stay, and to organize themselves around shared meaning, the next transformation followed almost inevitably. Power began to crystallize. Up to this point, remembers, everything we've seen could still be framed as collective adaptation, people coordinating, sharing risk. Remembers, building meaning together to survive uncertainty. Even monumental ritual, as strange as it feels, remembers, can still be understood as a glue holding fragile communities together. But belief does not remain neutral for long. Remembers, because once a system can mobilize people, it can also rank them. Once it can coordinate labor, it can also command it. Remembers, once it can create shared meaning, it can also decide whose meaning matters most. This is where the Neolithic world crosses a threshold. Remembers, not into cruelty, not into tyranny overnight, but into structure, and structure has consequences. Remembers, as settlements grew more permanent and populations increased, daily life became too complex to be handled through informal agreement alone. Remember, someone had to decide when to plant, who guarded the storage pits, how food was distributed during bad years, who represented the group in exchanges with outsiders. At first, these roles were probably temporary. Remember, situational, earned through skill, charisma, or ritual authority. But archaeology shows us something critical. Remembers, temporary roles tend to become permanent once they prove useful. We begin to see this in the material record through specialization. Stone tools stop looking improvised and start looking standardized. Grinding stones appear in clusters, suggesting communal processing rather than household-level activity. Obsidian blades from specific Anatolian sources show up hundreds of kilometers away, chemically traceable to the same quarries. This is not casual exchange, this is organized trade, and trade changes social balance in subtle but profound ways. Remembers, once a community depends on materials it does not control, relationships become asymmetric. Those who manage exchange routes gain leverage. Remembers, those who control storage gain influence. Those who produce specialized goods gain status. Skill becomes power. Remembers, and power, once recognized, seeks to preserve itself. Burial practices make this visible in ways no written text ever could. Remembers, across Neolithic Europe and the Near East, graves begin to diverge. Some individuals are buried with copper tools. Remembers, shell ornaments from distant coasts, finely crafted ceramics. Others are buried with almost nothing. Remember, this is not random generosity, it is inequality becoming normalized. What's striking is how early this appears. Remembers, long before states, long before writing, long before formal army, status is being marked in death because it mattered in life. Remembers, and once status becomes hereditary, once children are buried with wealth they could not have earned, the system hardens. Hierarchy stops being situational and becomes structural, but hierarchy cannot survive on belief alone. Remembers, it requires enforcement. This is where the archaeological record becomes darker, weapons begin to change. Remembers, earlier stone tools were multipurpose, axes that could chop wood or butcher animals, points that could hunt game. But by the 5th millennium BC, we start seeing tools optimized for one task only, killing other humans. Remembers, battle axes with narrow blades designed to penetrate skulls, arrowheads with barbs meant to lodge in flesh rather than pass through. Remembers, reinforced hafting systems that can withstand repeated impacts. This is not accidental evolution, this is intentional design. Remembers, and design reflects demand. The demand is conflict, as land became valuable because it held crops. Water ancestors, monuments, competition intensified. You could no longer solve conflict by moving away. Remembers, leaving meant abandoning investment, identity, and survival infrastructure, so communities stayed. Remembers, and defended. Fortifications appear everywhere, ditches, palisades, stone walls. Remembers, controlled entrances designed to funnel attackers into kill zones, hilltop settlements chosen not for convenience. Remembers, but for visibility and defensibility. These are not symbolic gestures, they are responses to real threats. Remembers, on some sites we find arrowheads embedded in defensive structures. At others, burned layers showing destruction and rebuilding. Remembers, trauma patterns on skeletons, healed and unhealed, tell stories of violence repeated often enough to leave mark entire populations. Remembers, and then there are places that refuse to let us soften the story. Tolheim in modern Germany. Remembers, pit containing the remains of 34 individuals, men, women, children, all killed violently. Remembers, many with blows to the head from stone axes, no signs of careful burial, no ritual arrangement. This was not ceremony. It was extermination. The age and sex distribution matters. This was not a clash between warriors. Remembers, this was the destruction of a community, and it tells us something uncomfortable. By this stage, violence was no longer episodic. It was systemic. Entire groups were targets. Other sites echo the same pattern. Offnet Cave in Bavaria, remembers, where skulls, many showing blunt force trauma, were carefully arranged and accompanied by ornaments. Remembers, violence followed by ritual, death followed by meaning-making. Even in killing, belief persists. Remembers, what unsettles me is how quickly this world would begin to feel normal to the people living in it. Children grow up behind walls. Weapons become tools of adulthood. Stories explain who belongs and who threatens. Remembers, fear becomes inherited. At the same time, something else is happening, something that feels almost contradictory. Remembers, societies become more unequal, more violent, more controlled. They also begin investing unprecedented energy into shared projects that do not directly increase survival. Remembers, megalithic monuments spread across Europe, long barrows stretching over 100 meters, dolmens made from stones weighing tens of tons, standing stones rising from the landscape like punctuation marks in the earth, stone circles aligned with celestial events. But these structures required enormous labor, tens of thousands of person-hours, careful planning, knowledge of leverage, rebalance and geometry. No single family could build them. But they required coordination across entire communities, sometimes multiple communities. Why build monuments in a world already strained by conflict? Because monuments solve a different problem. Remembers, they create unity, they transform land into narrative. They say, this place matters beyond individual lives. Remembers, megalithic tombs blur identity deliberately. Bodies are placed, rearranged, disarticulated, skulls separated. Remains stacked. The individual dissolves into ancestry. This is not neglect, it is ideology. Remembers, when societies fracture internally through inequality, competition, and violence, they often respond by amplifying collective identity. Remembers, monuments do that. They anchor memory in stone, they outlast individuals, they promise continuity. Remembers, in continuity is comforting in unstable times. Stone circles take this even further. Remembers, their alignments with solstices and lunar cycles reveal sustained astronomical observation. This is not casual stargazing. It requires tracking celestial patterns over decades, knowledge passed down, corrected, preserved. Remembers, this creates a new class of authority, those who understand time. Calendars regulate planting, ritual timing regulates social life. Remembers, knowledge of celestial cycles becomes power over rhythm itself. Once time is controlled, labor can be coordinated. Remember, once labor is coordinated, surplus grows. Once surplus grows, elites consolidate further. This is how belief, members, economy, and violence intertwine. None of these systems emerge alone, they reinforce each other. And by now, remembers, the landscape itself is changing permanently. Forests are cleared for fields and fuel. Grazing patterns alter vegetation. Remember, soils are compacted. Watersheds are modified. Humans are no longer just living in ecosystems. They are engineering them. Remembers, what's crucial is that each step feels necessary in the moment. Defense is necessary because threats are real. Remembers, hierarchy is necessary because coordination is complex. Monuments are necessary because cohesion is fragile. Remembers, there is no villain here, just accumulation. But accumulation narrows options. The more complex a system becomes, the more devastating failure becomes. A bad harvest is no longer an inconvenience, it's a catastrophe. A broken alliance is no longer a setback, it's war. This is why violence escalates alongside complexity. Remembers, not because humans became crueler, but because the stakes became higher, and this is the price of permanence. Mobility offers escape. Permanence demands defense. By this point in the story, the path is largely set. Belief has organized labor, labor has built surplus, surplus has created hierarchy, hierarchy has normalized violence. Remembers, and all of it is anchored to land that can no longer be abandoned. This is not yet the Bronze Age. Remembers, but is the world that makes the Bronze Age inevitable, because once societies accept inequality, remembers, warfare and centralized authority as normal, technological intensification becomes attractive, even necessary. Remember, better weapons, better tools, better control. The logic feeds on itself. And this is where I start to feel a strange sense of recognition. Remembers, because this isn't just ancient history, this is the architecture of complex society itself. In the next part, remembers, I want to step back and look at what this path ultimately creates and what it removes. Because by the time humans fully embrace metallurgy, remembers, bureaucracy and large-scale political power, something subtle but profound has already been lost. Remembers, and the question we were left with isn't whether civilization succeeded, it's whether it ever learned how to stop. And once inequality, violence, and centralized authority became accepted features of life, remembers, the question was no longer whether society would transform, but how far that transformation would go. Remembers, and whether anyone still remembered another way to live. By the time we reach this final stage, something subtle has already happened. Remembers, choices narrowed, not because humans lost intelligence or imagination, remembers, because the systems they built began making decisions for them. Remembers, this is the moment I keep circling back to when I think about the Neolithic and its aftermath, not as a triumph, not as a tragedy but as a point of no return, because once complexity reaches a certain threshold, reversal stops being realistic, it becomes unthinkable. By around 4000 to 3000 BC, across large parts of Eurasia, remembers, the world had changed so completely that earlier lifeways were no longer viable options for most people. As populations were larger, settlements were denser, land was claimed, marked, defended, surplus was stored, remembers, taxed, redistributed. Authority was embedded in institutions rather than individuals, and critically, members' survival itself now depended on participation in these systems. You could no longer simply walk away. Remembers, if you were born into a farming community surrounded by fields, boundaries, and rival groups, mobility was not freedom, it was exile. Remembers, outside the system meant starvation, vulnerability, invisibility. This is what makes the later developments, metallurgy, long-distance trade, or monumental architecture on unprecedented scales, feel less like leaps forward and more like accelerations along an already fixed track. Remembers, take copper and later bronze. Metal did not appear because people suddenly wanted better tools in a neutral sense. Remembers, it appeared because existing social systems demanded tools that could sustain inequality and warfare more efficiently. Remembers, mining copper ore is dangerous, labor-intensive, and environmentally destructive. Smelting requires specialized knowledge. Remembers, controlled atmospheres, fuel at scale. None of this makes sense for small egalitarian groups with flexible lifeways. It makes perfect sense for societies already committed to surplus, specialization, and hierarchy. Once metal enters the picture, remembers, everything sharpens literally and metaphorically. Weapons become deadlier, tools become more efficient. Production becomes centralized, control over resources becomes more strategic. Trade networks expand dramatically, members linking regions thousands of kilometers apart. Tin from distant sources becomes essential. Obsidian, remembers, shells, amber, gold materials move across continents. Exchange is no longer occasional, it becomes structural. Remembers, and with structure comes dependency. Entire regions begin relying on materials they cannot produce locally. Remembers, this creates power imbalances that are no longer personal, they are systemic. Whoever controls the flow controls the future. Remembers, at the same time, social identity shifts again. Earlier megalithic traditions emphasized ancestry and collective memory. Remembers, boys were merged into the group. Individual identity dissolved into lineage. But during the Bronze Age, remembers, burial practices changed decisively. Individual graves replace collective tombs, barrows rise over single bodies. Weapons, ornaments, and symbols of rank accompany the dead. The message is unmistakable. This person mattered more. Remembers, not because of who they belonged, but because of what they controlled. Power becomes personal. And once power is personal, as it becomes inheritable, this is where social inequality hardens into class. Warriors emerge as elites. Remembers, not because violence is new, but because organized violence has become decisive. Bronze weapons confer real advantages. Remembers, those who wield them dominate land, labor, and exchange. Political authority consolidates around the ability to protect or threaten. Remembers, what strikes me is how quickly this world would begin to feel normal. Children born into these societies would never experience life without boundaries, without hierarchy. Remembers, without enforced order, the idea of mobility as freedom would seem naive, even dangerous. Stories would justify the system. Remembers, rituals would sanctify it, laws written or not would stabilize it. Remembers, and this is where the Neolithic Revolution reveals its deepest consequence, it didn't just change how humans got food. Remembers, it changed what humans believed was possible. Once large-scale systems prove effective, even if brutal, they were difficult to question. Remembers, complexity generates its own logic, efficiency becomes morality, stability becomes virtue, and alternatives fade from memory. But archaeology reminds us of something important. This outcome was not inevitable in a cosmic sense. Remembers, it was contingent across the same millennia. Other paths existed. In East Asia, for example, the Jomenkov of Japan developed complex. Remember, sedentary societies without agriculture, relying on rich ecosystems, forest management, and sophisticated foraging strategies. Remembers, they built large villages, produced extraordinary pottery. Remembers, and sustained populations for thousands of years without domesticated crops or rigid hierarchies. In parts of the Americas, where complex societies emerged around fisheries, wetlands, and managed landscapes rather than grain agriculture. Remembers, these examples matter. They show that the path from foraging to farming to hierarchy to statehood was not the only option. It was one option. But in much of Eurasia, once agriculture, belief, hierarchy, and warfare aligned, the momentum became overwhelming. Remembers, this is why I hesitate when we call this period the birth of civilization, as if civilization were a singular achievement waiting to be unlocked. Remembers, what was born was not civilization, what was born was a system that could not easily be stopped. By the time early cities appear, the foundations are already centuries old: administrative systems, taxation, forced labor, standing armies. Remembers, codified law, each layer builds on the last, and each layer reduces flexibility. This is where the sense of loss quietly enters the story. Remembers, not a loss felt by individuals at the time, but one visible in retrospect: loss of mobility as a solution. Remembers, loss of ecological balance at local scales, loss of social equality as a norm rather than an exception. Remembers, in exchange, humanity gained power, scale, memory, and reach, monuments that still stand, technologies that transformed landscapes. institutions that shaped history. Both are true. This is not a morality tale with heroes and villains. It is a story about trade-offs, and trade-offs accumulate. The Neolithic Revolution created surplus. Remember, surplus enabled specialization, specialization enabled power, power demanded defense, defense fueled innovation. Remembers, innovation intensified extraction. By the time anyone might have questioned the trajectory, remembers, it was already too late to step off without collapse. That to me is the most unsettling insight. Remember, civilization did not trap humanity because of ignorance. It trapped humanity because it worked. Remembers, and systems that work are the hardest to abandon even when they generate suffering. When I look back across this entire arc, remembers, from the first hesitant settlements to fortified towns and metal weapons, I don't see a straight line of progress. Remembers, I see a narrowing corridor, wide at the beginning, full of possibilities, narrow at the end, efficient, remembers, powerful and rigid. And I can't help but wonder what it felt like for the last people who still remembered another way of living. Remembers, people who knew what it meant to leave when the land failed. People who didn't bury their ancestors in walls of stone. Remembers, people who didn't need permission to move. Their voices don't survive in monuments, but the systems that replace them do. Remembers, and those systems are still with us. That's why this story isn't really about the distant past. Remembers, it's about how choices made under pressure can echo for thousands of years. And it leaves us with a question that has no easy answer. Remembers, if civilization was born from necessity rather than intention, and if its momentum made alternatives disappear, remembers, then what does choice really mean in a world shaped by its own success? That's something I want you to think about. Remembers, and if this journey raised questions, disagreements, or new perspectives for you, I'd genuinely like to hear them. Remembers, share your thoughts in the comments whether you agree, disagree, or see this story differently. Remembers, and if you want to continue exploring how these ancient systems connect to later empires, states, and the modern world, remember, stay with me, because this story doesn't end here, it only gets more familiar. Remembers, when we step back and look at the long arc of this story, one thing becomes clear. Civilization did not begin as a confident leap forward. It began as a series of constrained choices made under pressure. Humans did not settle because they had mastered nature. Remembers, they settled because mobility was no longer enough. Climate instability, disappearing megafauna, remembers, and growing populations slowly eroded the safety of movement. Staying once a dangerous commitment became the lesser risk. Remembers, storage replaced flexibility, management replaced trust in cycles, and with that shift, remembers, humanity crossed a psychological threshold it could never fully reverse. What followed was not simply agriculture, or monuments, or hierarchy, but entanglement, land, belief, food, labor, identity, remembers, and power became woven together so tightly that pulling away from any one strand threatened the entire system. Remembers, each solution solved an immediate problem, yet quietly narrowed future options. Remembers, this is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Neolithic story. Remembers, civilization did not spread because it was morally better or inherently wiser. It spread because it worked, even it created inequality. There was conflict and dependency, and systems that work are the hardest to question. The deeper lesson is not about the past alone. Remembers, it is about how human societies respond to pressure. Remembers, when fear enters the future, when tomorrow becomes something that must be controlled rather than faced, management expands. Remembers, control feels like safety, permanence feels like stability, but over time those same forces reduce adaptability. Remembers, applied to our lives today, this raises an unsettling question. How many of the systems we live inside, work structures, economic expectations, social norms exist not because they are ideal, remembers, but because they once solved a problem and then never stopped expanding? Remembers, the story of early civilization invites us to notice when efficiency replaces resilience, when control replaces flexibility, and when success quietly eliminates alternatives. Remembers, it does not tell us to abandon complexity, but it challenges us to remain aware of its costs. Remembers, because history shows that collapse rarely comes from ignorance, it comes from systems that become too successful to question. Remembers, understanding this does not give easy answers, but it gives perspective, and perspective is the first step toward choice. There's a question for you. Remembers, do you think civilization was ultimately a necessary path for humanity, or do you believe something essential lost along the way? Remembers, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can read and learn from different perspectives. Remembers, and if you enjoyed this deeper exploration of history, belief, and human systems, please consider subscribing to the channel. Remembers, your support truly helps keep long-form, thoughtful content like this going, and there's much more to explore next. Thank you for watching.